We've partnered with Nissa Tzun and her group Force Trajectory, which is a 2009 organization created to document the rippling effects of police violence in communities and helps the families who have lost loved ones to police murder. Victor Dempsey experienced the unforgivable murder of his brother, Delron Smalls, by the NYPD's mishandling in 2016. Nissa will give Victor a much more proper introduction shortly. We have been able to learn so much from Nissa and Victor about post-shooting unwillingness to call for medical attention, how to hold the police accountable, and what actionable steps we can take right now as we're here listening tonight. So just a few housekeeping rules. Force Trajectory, Mina and I will be recording this session, but we ask others not to for the protection of the various audience. I will be muting everyone while Nissa and Victor is speaking until it's time for the Q&A. As you think of the questions you want to ask during Q&A, I'm going to ask that you type it into the chat box for everyone to see, so that, or it can just be privately to Mina or I, and we will, during the Q&A sessions, call on people in the order of the relevance of the question, so that Victor and Nissa can address the most relevant questions first. So I will now turn it over to Force Trajectory, to Nissa and Victor, to talk about the history of police brutality and Victor's individual experience.
Hey everyone, thanks for joining us. Can everyone hear me? Yeah, everyone's good? Okay, good. Great. Okay, so hi again, my name is Nissa Tzun with Force Trajectory Project. We have been doing this work for 11 years. It started off with knowing, not knowing, but let's just say a curiosity that started within myself in regards to how police brutality narratives are constructed in the media. I met my first impacted family in 2009. It was the case of Kenny Lazo, who was beaten to death by 5 Suffolk County plainclothes detectives in Long Island, Suffolk County, in 2008. And the family reached out to an organization that I was working with in 2009. And so I was sent out there as a photographer to photograph the family. And in the midst of doing that, you know, Jennifer, who was the partner, the mother of Kenny's son, was telling me what happened. And I was just alarmed. I mean, it was a straight up lynching. It was a straight up, to this day is one of the most violent cases I've ever worked on. And in hearing her story, and then going home later that night and Googling the account myself just to do some research, the narrative between the family and the narrative that was the official narrative in the media, the police narrative, was just, I mean, it was just night and day. It might as well have been a completely different story. And so within myself, I had a lot of questions. I was like, well, what, you know, immediately was the, my own prejudice. The question I had was, well, what did he do? Right? That's usually the first question that people ask, like, well, what did he do? Did he deserve this? I mean, did he provoke the police, et cetera, et cetera. And so I knew within myself that I had some deprogramming that I had to do. And I started researching police killings to, you know, figure out if there was a pattern. And then I knew that the only way I was going to be able to find out how to uncover this was to continue meeting impacted folks and listening to their narratives and continuously comparing the media stories with the family stories. And so in the midst of that, I met my partner, who was already doing the oral history of impact people, because his best friend had been killed a few, like now it's about 17 years ago, and his best friend was killed by St. Louis police. And so from his experience, he had already been, you know, doing the oral histories. And so we basically married our skills of visual and sound and started creating multimedia pieces that uplifted the narratives of those who are directly impacted by it, and also witnesses. And then more recently, we started working with police brutality survivors as well. In the midst of this work, we were brought into a network of impacted people, impacted families. In New York City is a very active city, as you guys know, as y'all are over there. Hi, New Yorkers. You know, we were basically trained and taught by, the late Nicholas Hayward, who recently passed, he fought for his son's case to be reopened. His son was 13 years old, Nicholas Hayward Jr. Presente, was killed in 1994. And he worked nearly 25 years to get that case reopened and was not able to open the case successfully. And then many other veteran families in New York also we worked with. In 2011, the group that we were a part of, which is called the October 22nd Coalition, the national coordinator, her name is Monica Shea. She was, for her full-time job, she was a professor and dean of arts and sciences at Pratt Institute. She was murdered in a mass murder on her family while she was at her vacation home in rural Pennsylvania. And as the national coordinator of October 22nd Coalition, which is the longest running anti-police brutality coalition in the nation, she was the glue, so to speak, of all the impacted families. And so this was just another another trauma that impacted families in New York and really across the country, because she worked for everybody, had to go through, just losing another person that was advocating for them. And so in that moment, myself and other young people in October 22nd realized that we couldn't really continue this work without really learning how to engage impacted people, how to build long-term sustainable relationships with people who are living with long-term trauma. And so we started doing that work. We started building relationships with these folks. And one of my closest friends became, one of the impacted folks became my closest confidant and friend. Her name is Cynthia Howell, and she recently passed May of 2017. And in 2014, her and I created, basically we started this nationwide coalition called Families United for Justice. At the time, it was just really about getting New York families together to come to the table to have a voice in the movement, and for that voice to be led by those who are directly impacted. Because time and time again in this movement, we have come across too many situations and examples of families being exploited for their stories being used for trauma porn, for notoriety, like being close to someone famous as if that was a thing, being tokenized, being told to come to a protest to speak and share their traumatic story, but then not have any of their needs fulfilled, like, getting a taxi for them or anything really at all. Like there's just a very strong lack of appropriate community response and support to these impacted people. And so that was the reason why we decided to create Families United for Justice, because it became clear to us over the years that this was a movement that had to be family-centered, and that the only people that could really do that correctly were those who were directly impacted. And so that's how Families United for Justice came to be. And in that, a few years later, I was doing work. We ended up moving to Las Vegas, which is where we are now. But as you know, throughout the years, we have created a national network of families, so we work all over. I received an opportunity to work with Long Island families in 2016 in the summer. And so I returned to New York City to do that project. And in the midst of my time there, a string of police killings happened, starting with Victor's brother, Delron Small. Delron Small was killed in a road rage incident on July 4th, the evening of July 4th. Shortly after that, I can't remember if it came first, Alton Sterling and then Philando Castile were killed. And those became nationally recognized cases due to how the narrative came out, right? And so what is often unheard in police homicide cases is the fact that the media plays a humongous role in whether or not a family gets support, whether or not that story becomes a nationally known case. Our journalism institution is unfortunately, along with all our other institutions in America, are rooted in racist capitalism. And so what that means is that if it bleeds, it leads, right? We all have heard that term probably, that phrase. And so, you know, that's why we know the names of Amadou Diallo and Sean Bell and Philando Castile and George Floyd and Eric Garner, is because these were particular cases that had that element of sensationalism, right? Sean Bell was killed the night before his wedding day. Philando Castile's, the aftermath of the shooting was live streamed on Facebook, et cetera, et cetera. And so it's these stories that get heard, and then the national attention gets drawn to all these nationally known cases, which again, I mean, there's benefits to that, right? It's important for us to be paying attention to what's happening, but at the same time, that attention is not at all on the those who are directly impacted in your own zip code. And so that's one of the things that we're working on right now with the campaign. And I'll let Victor talk about that. But I wanted to introduce Victor. So I'll just start with how we met, just to kind of start it off on a good note. And I'm really grateful that this is something that we can talk about now in retrospect and laugh about, despite the fact that this was probably one of the most hardest times for Victor, because he had just found out about the killing of his brother. So, you know, a lot of the times impacted people become their own investigators. They become extremely vigilant to get justice for their loved ones, because, you know, as what's happening is happening to them, doors are shutting in their face from all angles. I mean, in regards to their communication with police, in regards to their communication with the media, with access to any kind of advocacy whatsoever, any kind of platform. And so families tend, especially in New York, tend to go to the officer involved shooting site or the crime scene as it happens, as they find out about it. And in response to Delron Small's killing, there was a memorial that was held by the community, by the family, 2 days after the killing. And so Cynthia called me. Actually, I'm not even sure how that happened, but I believe she called me. And we ended up, along with Eric Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, the family of Chantel Davis, Natasha Duncan, and Angie Hicks. Who else was there? The family of Jason Tirado, the family of Akai Gurley, Hortensia Peterson. Everybody came together to greet and, you know, meet with the Delron Small family, and to be there as a source of support for them, to be like, hey, the families are here, we're here to have your back. And so when I went there, it was a very, very tense situation, as you all can imagine. It was in East New York, and just people were really upset, obviously, you know, because somebody had literally just been taken and erased from the planet in their community. And as I'm navigating as a photojournalist with my camera, people are kind of getting into a space where they're kind of sardined together, and it was getting really tense. And I was just like, you know, maybe I don't need to be in this crowd. It's just really crowded, and I'm getting a little anxious. I shouldn't be in the center of this. And, you know, Cynthia turns to me and she's like, come with me. We're going to meet the family. And I'm just like, nah, I'm just going to sit out of this one because I have a camera and it doesn't look good. I'm Asian. Everyone here is Black, and they're really upset. And I might get mistaken for like a New York Times photographer or something. So she was just like, don't worry about that. You're with the family. So she grabbed me. She pulled me. I mean, I want you guys to think like mosh pit style. Like people were really close together. She pulled me into the center where the family was. And Victor looks at me, and he looks at my camera, and I mean, the rage on his face, just like, oh no, this person's about to, like, exploit my family. And so and Victor's a big guy. I mean, he's just a really big guy, and his arm, you know, wingspan was very long. And in slow motion, I want you guys to imagine Victor's huge arm just coming and like swatting my camera and about to swat my head, and Cynthia blocking his hand and in slow motion saying, she with the families. And so she literally saved me from getting brutalized by Victor. And that's how our friendship began. I ended up capturing that moment of him speaking for the first time about his brother. That's on the website on forcedtrajectory.com. You can check it out in the talk section. If you just scroll all the way down, you'll see it. But that was the birth of Victor's activism and our friendship and his entrance into Families United for Justice and our work together collaboratively. So with that, I introduce Victor Dempsey.
Thank you, Nissa. Good evening, everybody. Hey, Tiffany. Thank you for having me again. So really quick, just before I just want to get out the way now. So it's very close to my brother's memorial anniversary. So I've been like in tears half the day and just trying to stay strong. So I just want to get it out the way because I don't want anybody to feel like, oh, it's too much. It's not traumatic. Believe me, I'm a warrior. I got this. But I just want to get it out now. So if see any fireworks come on, we're going to push through it. But yeah, Nissa, thank you for the introduction. And every time she tells that story now, like we honestly laugh about it now, but I literally remember that day every single day. I remember the rage. I remember the hurt, the pain, the anger, the confusion, everything. I remember, really looking into the sea of people of the crowd in East New York. My brother was really highly, highly favored and loved. So the amount of folks that was out there was just insane. But I do remember looking into the crowd, just looking for somebody to blame, It really had nothing to do with Nissa and her camera, but everyone was on edge and I was on edge, It seemed at that time in my life, I was propelled to the front lines of my family, so to speak. And I know now, but I realized it took me almost 8 months to even acknowledge the fact that my brother's gone. Like as soon as it happened, everything just boom. We're meeting with lawyers, we're meeting with attorneys, we're meeting with police, we're getting phone calls from reporters. We gotta get a story out there. We gotta tell them what happened. And I'm gonna tell the whole story a little bit more about myself, but this is like, just to get it out, like when Nissa said those dates, and this is something that I always say anytime I speak to remind folks of how brutal mainstream media can be. July 4th, 2016, Delron Smoke was murdered. July 5th, 2016, Walter Stone was murdered. July 6th, 2016, Philando Castile was murdered. July 9th, 2016 was when the Texas sniper shot the 6 officers out in Houston, Texas. So you can imagine with all of that going on, and to put the cherry on top, my brother was lied on. The victim became the suspect. Wayne Isaacs, the officer who murdered my brother, said that he repeatedly hit him over and over and over. And then there was some bogus eyewitness that actually went on the news and said, yes, I seen a guy hitting him. It took 8 days for me to gain some kind of support. It took 8 days for people to believe me. It really took 8 days for me to feel like I'm not going crazy. Because once they said what happened, and I said, no, that's impossible. My brother would never. My brother was driving home from a barbecue, July 4th, Independence Day cookout, with my 3-month-old nephew in the back of the car, my at the time 14-year-old niece and his girlfriend at the time. As he's driving home, the off-duty officer is driving as well, but he's driving really erratically on the road, just kind of in a rage, so to speak. And on multiple occasions, even from the video footage that we watched through the trial, my brother had to dodge other cars to not get into an accident or to avoid getting into an accident. And unfortunately, they both came to a stop at a red light, which coincidentally was literally the left-hand turn was my brother's house. And the other messed up part about it was in front of my family barbershop. We owned that shop for almost 17 years. So they get to the stoplight, my brother gets out the car for whatever reason, me knowing him because we were literally like inseparable. He's a family man. He's what a lot of folks call an alpha male. Folks looked up to him. Folks appreciated what he had to say. Any room he walked into, you just noticed he was there. And I'm a big guy. I'm 6'2", about 260 pounds, in shape. But my brother was bigger than me. So looking at him, he can seem menacing, I guess. Or he can't seem intimidating, but believe me, we're like the biggest teddy bears in the world. It's ridiculous. But I'm assuming that he would have approached that car and said, what's going on? I got my kids in the car. Something to that nature, because that's how much I know him. Unfortunately, as my brother approached the vehicle, As soon as he approached the vehicle, instantaneously he was shot 3 times. After getting shot, my brother literally crawled. He crawled, a grown man, 6'3.5", crawling. Then, and forgive me if I'm too vulgar, but sometimes when I tell folks what happened, when I tell his story, I like to tell his story, not what I know, what I feel like my brother felt. So please forgive me, but a lot of times I think folks don't really know what families go through. So I like to tell his story, the way I see it or the way I felt it. My brother literally crawled to his death. Unfortunately, he was shot 3 times in the session. During the trial, we learned that had he not been shot 3 times, maybe once he could have lived. 1 bullet hit his hip, which kind of paralyzed him or made it hard for him to have been able to walk. So we kind of did see him limp a little bit before he started to crawl. Another bullet grazed him, which really wouldn't have done anything or wasn't life-threatening. And we don't know which one, first, second, or third, but another bullet actually punctured his lung. My brother unfortunately crawled and then drowned to his death. During the trial, we also learned that the officer who shot my brother got out of his vehicle. We see him through the video walk up to my brother, look at him, and walk away. He pulls out his phone, find out the trial. The first thing he called was his lieutenant and said that he just discharged his firearm. The lieutenant said, "Is anybody shot?" He said, "I've been hit in the face." He said, "Is anybody hurt?" "I've been punched in the face." Then the next call was to 911. He says, "I've been hit in the face. Please come. I'm an MOS, which means member of service. Please come. My face hurts. I'm in a lot of pain." They asked the location. Where was he? They asked him to stay on the line, and ambulance arrives. Not once did this man say that there is a man dying. Not once did that officer say there's somebody bleeding out. Not once did that officer say that he needs another ambulance for this man. So for me, going through the trial and listening to every detail, being there every single day, listening to the jurors, and getting all the way up to an acquittal, it was literally like my brother got murdered in front of me 2 times. Because that trial was what we had to get justice. That trial was what we had to make it make sense. So I don't have to blame anybody anymore. So that's my brother's story of what happened to him. And kind of want to back up a little bit now and just say why it's so important that I tell his story more, but kind of tie it into why I do the work today, you know. My mother died when I was 3 years old. Me, my brother, and my sister, we grew up in foster care, group homes. Unfortunately, I got locked up after I graduated high school at 17 years old. Went to prison for 4 years. Took a plea bargain for 5 years for an attempted robbery and assault charge. Now, mind you, my mother dying at 3 didn't help because we bounced around from group home to group home, foster care to foster care, until eventually we all landed to a group home. But my brother was an adult already. He moved on. But he became my father. He became my role model. He became the guy that we looked to. He became the person who answered all the questions for me and my sister, you know. He was our protector, provider, everything. And, you know, as we started getting older and we became adults, he just had all the answers. Like, he did every single thing right. So he made mistakes in his life. Unfortunately, he was incarcerated himself. But at this point in his life, when he was murdered, he did every single thing right for like 7 years. Every single thing, literally, like everything. Like, you know, like when you get everything together and you just want to brag every time you come around. "What's up, bro? Let's go out. Oh, let's do this today." Like, he was that happy. And it was just nuts because he's so damn big. He's always happy. So it was just weird. But it was fun. And when he became a supervisor at his job was the same week he found out that he was going to have a boy. And my son, his son and my son are 4 months apart. And my son's name was Caden. He named his son Zayden. That was like the highlight of our lives as adults. Like, he finally got a boy. He has 2 older girls before that. They're like adults now. And he just got a boy. So we made jokes about it. And then we went out to this club to get drinks. And the last picture we took together, we were too drunk to drive home. And there was a hotel across the street. So all our friends are like, nah, you're not driving, just get a hotel. So the hotel was full, and there was only one room left. So the guy said, all right, well, you guys can have the room. So we both took the room. So me and this idiot are both fighting for the bed, and we're wrestling on the bed, rolling around, and then like one of my friends took a picture, and I still have the picture, like I walk around with it everywhere I go now, and that was the last moment that two big-ass grown men were just rolling around on the bed and just captured a moment where we were just like in heaven. I say all that because to understand who he was to us is to understand how much we miss him and how much he meant to everybody else and why we fight. Had Nissa not seen my big hand coming towards the camera that day, or had the families not come with her to be at our aid, we would have been lost. Like, the police brutality world is a different beast when it comes to fighting illegally. It's not like your regular district attorney or robbery or assault charge. It's a big difference. These are experts that know this system, that's practiced, that live in the system, and we're going against it off a whim. So to have the support of other families who, like Eric Garner's mother, Gwen Carr, like Katinsia Peterson, Akai Gurley's aunt, to have them by our side and say, hey, we got you, we're going to walk you through this, was monumental in the track of our case. At the time, in 2015, the families prior to my family were busting their butts working on what they call the special prosecutor bill. That special prosecutor bill was put in place so police-involved shootings of unarmed men would not be investigated or tried by the local district attorney's office because of the relationship between district attorney's office and local police departments. So in this instance, the special prosecutor would be the attorney general. My family was the first family to utilize that bill and take it all away. And I had amazing confidence in the AG's office. I worked with them hand in hand. They didn't hide stuff from me, but they were honest with me and say things they couldn't tell me for whatever reasons or sake of the case, which I really appreciated. But going through the whole trial and really listening to the laws that the judge talks about, like, we had to really pay attention to the jurors. And thinking about the families that came to support me and thinking about the process we had to go through jury selection to the end of it when we got the verdict, it made so much sense to me how we lost that trial. We lost that trial because, unfortunately, this is not an everyday kind of case. The instructions are completely different. Like, literally, the judge's instructions are completely different. The way you have to interpret certain definitions and meanings when it comes specifically to officers is completely nuts. So the jurors, regardless if they heard a great case, in which I do believe the prosecutors put up, they didn't understand the definition of duty to retreat for an officer. They couldn't understand it. And that was the big difference. During break, they sent 3 notes back to the judge to ask to clarify it. They just couldn't understand. Not listening like duty to retreat. But yeah, for an officer, that's very hard to interpret. Oh, can you guys hear me? Sorry, thumbs up. All right, sorry. So at that moment, you know, with all the rage and the hatred that I had at that moment for that acquittal, I understood that my job now, like the families before me that tried to help me, walk me through step by step and paid attention to every single thing that was next to what's next, I had to do the same for other families. Now, going through that process of the trial, I realized we have to do public education. We have to make our communities aware of what's going on. We have to let them know the inside track. We have to. That's the only way we'll be able to get support. Because any one of us can be called for the next case as a juror. Any one of us. So for me to educate you onto what meanings are or to what happens, that could be the tipping the scale and, unfortunately, the next police-involved shooting that comes. So with all of that being said, and talking about the uprisings around George Floyd and the recent protests and everything, you know, watching George Floyd get murdered just brought back so much trauma for not just my family, but families across the nation, brothers, sisters, aunts, whoever, because it literally brought us, we knew watching it exactly what his family was feeling at that exact moment. It was like a wave of emotions sweeping across the nation. and everybody's phones just start going off like, hey, are you okay? Hey, did you check on so-and-so? Hey, like, it's like your own little hotline of insanity. And we knew those emotions. So if anyone kind of followed exactly what's going on during those times and those current events, you didn't really see any impacted families in the beginning or the first 4 days to 5 days or so saying anything publicly. You didn't see the Gwen Cards. You didn't see the Sean Bell. Nobody. Somebody showed me an article because we felt the pain. That pain was bittersweet though. Because what happened was you had this family of George Floyd garnering all of this much needed attention, right? And then we see the world coming out of their shells and their pandemic homes to support this family and to call for the officers to be fired and tried. But then we have families who've been fighting for the last 10, 8, 9, 5, 4, 3, 2 years saying, but what about my loved one? It wasn't, no, not George Floyd. It was like, but what about? And the reason why I say it's bittersweet because we had to say, you know what? We're not victims. We're warriors. We're going to capitalize on this moment and we're going to use this platform to propel everyone's story to the forefront. Because with the millions and millions of protesters, with the millions and millions of folks who are interested now, for the millions of folks who are now watching and listening, now's the time to strike. Now's the time to educate. So we went on a campaign, or backtrack. Nissa put together a panel like this one, and it was called Our Response. It was the families, impact of families, our response to the protesting. And we said we had to respond because once this uprising happened and nobody realized how long it was going to be, how big it was going to be, they said, but what are they protesting for? Why is everybody out here? Then they said, oh, we want to get the officers fired. Okay, now we locked them up and we charged them. What else do you want? And then it's like, oh, well, we want social equity. We want the racism to end now. You know what I mean? Black Lives Matter. Okay, great. Now they're listening. Now reforms are happening. Now police reforms are coming around. What else do you want? Now we're at defund. So these different phases of breaking that oppressive state is happening now. So we say with the protesting and folks getting locked up and beat up, and then it's chaos in the streets. And then they're saying, well, it's a distraction. What are you fighting for? So now we started this campaign, families are the front lines. What does that mean? That you want to know what you're fighting for, let the family show you what we're fighting for. Let the family show you how we've been fighting for years prior to this. Let the family show you how we know we can get real change through the legislative process, through the making sure we're voting process, through all of these processes where you feel like there's an injustice there, but you do have some form of control or some form of power in the form of your vote or in the form of support where you can garner that attention from your local elected officials. So I can go on and on about this. Kind of want to bounce it back to Nissa to talk a little bit more about the campaign. But tonight, I hope if anything we can take from this is our mission and our message resonates with everyone here so we can really understand how we can support each other. Because hopefully else we can get through this call is the other side that we want. Last thing I really want to get out of it is police brutality shows no colorism. There's no colorism when it comes to impacted families. We're Black, we're Indigenous, we're white, we're Hispanic, we're Asian, we're everything. There's no colorism. So when we talk about Black Lives Matter and everything like that, we have to be inclusive. We're an inclusive club. We can't go out front and say it's only for Black lives. I'm a Black man. I do believe in Black Lives Matter. But I also know this fight is not that fight. This fight is a little bit different. So navigating that field as well, I know it's confusing and I know it can be conflicting. But we also know, like we say, families are the front lines. So Nissa, you want to talk a little bit more about that?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Victor. And thank you everyone for continuing to listen and be engaged. So before I continue to talk about the campaign, I wanted to just give a few more statistics and facts about police violence that might help explain and give light to what's actually happening. Because what's known to the public is it's really just scraping the surface of police violence. And I do want to mention that in the years we've been fighting against police brutality, which has been since the beginning of this country, there is no infrastructure of support for impacted folks. So there's no funeral fund, there's no pathway to adequate representation, legal representation. There's no pathway to medical health care or mental health care. There's none of that. And in fact, as one of the only organizations that advocates for impacted people and documents it, all other nonprofits that I found that actually work with and include and support impacted people are founded by impacted people. There are many organizations that do tokenize and exploit families and claim to work for families, but they literally compete with, for example, there is a New York organization that literally tried to derail Families United for Justice from existing because they were threatened by the idea of those directly impacted organizing for themselves, because that's how they get their funding. So this is an issue where those who are the most vulnerable, those who are directly impacted, are also the most exploited by a racist capitalist system. So I want people to understand that. In regards to frequency of police killings, in terms of what we know, because there actually isn't a governing body that counts or documents police killings, which is absolutely alarming. The FBI has been taking justifiable homicide statistics in police departments for many years, but statistics are largely inadequate and not accurate. They report 400 to 600 justifiable homicides per year on average, whereas October 22nd spearheaded the Stolen Lives Project, which is the first civilian database created to count police killings across the nation. And that they started documenting that in the mid-90s. And that became the first civilian database. Now we have several civilian databases, and the average is over 1,000 to 600 people per year in America. So it's happening 3 to 5 times per day, which is frightening. It is the 6th leading cause of death for young men in America from, I think, ages of like 18 to 25. Those who are largely impacted include those who are suffering from a mental disability or mental illness. 51+% of police homicide victims are suffering from a mental illness. And then, of course, in regards to vulnerability, we know that Black people, the darker skinned you are, the more targeted you are. But obviously, this is an issue that affects all colors, everybody. So to talk about the campaign, when Victor was telling his story, I'm glad that he did tell it the way that he did, because it links to the journalism aspect, the media aspect that I was talking about earlier. Had that surveillance video of Delron's killing been released immediately, everybody in America would know Delron Small's name. And that's the difference, right? I want people to understand that. The reason why we don't know Delron Small's name, even people in New York don't know Delron Small's name, is because who took control of the narrative? The police did, which is what they normally do. And it's only in instances where the family or witnesses or some kind of strange anomaly allows, like social media, allows for the community and the family to have control of the narrative, does that change things, okay? So really important to understand that when you're reading the news. When you're reading the news and you hear about, oh, police just killed somebody or this and that and the other, I want you guys to remember that the only thing that's true in that narrative is that that person is dead. And that sometimes is misreported as well. So you can count on that 99% of the time as being true, but in regards to what happened, it's really important for people to be open-minded and realize that just because you're reading a 2-sentence narrative from breaking news does not mean that that's what happened. People literally have to go in and investigate themselves, and that's the reason why we exist. So about the campaign, so Right now, our campaign is, we went to Las Vegas. The whole point of families from, all over the country coming to Las Vegas was to uplift local cases and to get the Las Vegas community to listen deeply to those who have been locally impacted. And we're still in the process of doing that. We're still right now here in Las Vegas, we're organizing with impacted folks and getting their individual demands figured out, getting their collective demands figured out. And we're going to be having panels to highlight local Las Vegas cases, inviting the Las Vegas community to listen to those local cases and then kind of figure out where they can support the most, whether it's packing the courtroom, whether it's demanding, whether it's taking that message and demand during their protest and making sure that demand gets out there. We went to Seattle for Charlene Lyle's 3rd year anniversary. She was a Black woman who was pregnant, called the police to report an armed to report a burglary, and then ended up getting killed by police in front of her children. And when we went there, the press conference and the vigil were very powerful. And so this directly speaks to the community response that we want to see for all these cases, right? So the first year of Charlene Lyle's vigil, 400 to 600 people showed up, which is pretty good for a locally known case. The second year was a very intimate vigil. They had maybe like less than 100 people there. The third vigil, which was, just a few weeks ago, June 18th, 1,500 people showed up to the vigil. That's exactly the kind of community response that we need to have if we want to see a change in our system and basically achieve justice in these local cases. So our effort today, really talking to Tiffany and Mina and organizing this panel with Victor and myself, was really about getting New York on board and to be educated and to be looking out for local cases and educating people about local cases and seeing how, as a local community, you all can support those local cases. So that's where we're at with the campaign right now. We are going to be planning some Zoom panels, and then hopefully, if COVID doesn't get worse, we will be traveling from city to city to uplift local cases and uplift those families. So thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay, so we're going to take some audience questions now. Michael, you had the first question, so let me go ahead and unmute you. Let me find and unmute you. Ask to mute. Okay, so Michael should be able to say his question soon.
Now, hi, thank you for your presentation. That was very interesting. I have a background in policing in a weird sort of way. When I was an undergraduate, I was a guest member of a night division in Somerville, Massachusetts for 5.5 or 6 months. And I did an ethnography on policing, trying to explain different policing styles. And since then, I've actually been involved off and on with policing issues. I was an assistant to an attorney. I'm an attorney, but I was an assistant to an attorney whose job it is to monitor the Colt Commission in Los Angeles with the Sheriff's Department, make sure that they're playing by the rules that were imposed upon them. And so off and on, I watch all this stuff kind of you sort of become a little despairing of change in the context of police because of the sort of, and I don't want to speechify, I just want to sort of present where I'm coming from. The sort of like structural reality of policing is that from a political standpoint, the unions are very strong. It's a very politicized entity, and ultimately they're charged with law and order. So their first job is one of public relations, which is why you have the media joined at the hip with them to make sure that whatever else happens, whatever mistakes they make, that it doesn't result in a breakdown in, their authority, which is like the first and last concern. So I'm curious about whether you guys have given some thought to how you can making inroads through your initiative with the police directly to try and change things up, not just with the citizens like us, but with how receptive are some police to coming and hearing about victims and seeing things from the other side, in a kind of neutral way.
You know, thank you for that, Michael, for that question too. You know, because it's really hard sometimes, especially when you're dealing with trauma, to kind of see the good in things all the time, right? And the reason why I say that is because almost every single one of us, I'm guilty of it as well, but every single one of us, at some moment in my mind, I said just to hell to law enforcement. You know what I mean? At some moment, I said that. But then my good friend, sister here, Nissa, earlier this month, she sent me a reminder. She sent me a video from the very vigil that I met her at, the very first time I really spoke out. And in that video, I remember saying to the officers, because it was very tense out there that day, you know, everyone was hurt. It was grief everywhere. And the way we didn't announce the vigil, we didn't announce the rally, we didn't announce the protest, we didn't want police escorts. Nobody wants to deal with police at that moment. But at one moment when the march ended by where my brother passed, you see a wall of officers just line up like directly across from us. And we weren't being rowdy either. We were marching and chanting, but no one was rowdy. But then the mere presence of this wall that they put up started to rile people up. Just the thought of them here, like you have the audacity to really be here in this demanding demeanor while everyone's grieving. So in that moment, like I said, in the beginning, in my head, I was just to hell with law enforcement. But in that moment, I heard all these people cursing. Everyone just cursed. It's like a whirlwind going in my head. And I'm just staring at the officers in these uniforms, and I'm looking at them, a very diverse lineup, you know, white officers, black officers, Latino, women, men. I'm just looking at all of them. And I remember saying to myself, you're human too. And when I started to speak on the microphone that day, I said to them, this is what we're talking about. This is the oppression that we're dealing with. You come out here and we're being peaceful and you're still trying to do it, like, do your job. All we're out here to say, do your job. Like an officer murdered somebody, do your job. And in the video, I made an analogy of if the officers go out to a restaurant and they eat food, and the cooks, they're doing a job. They're making your food for you that you're ordering and you're paying for. And if that food comes to your table and you don't like the service, you're gonna complain about the service. You're gonna send it back. You're gonna speak to your manager, right? And I said that day, 3 or 4 years ago, and I said it to the officers, we're out here because we don't like your service. We don't like how you're running the department. We don't like what you guys are doing. So now we're complaining about the service of public servants that I pay for, that we pay for. And this was the second day after my brother was murdered. I was already thinking so far past this because I'm looking at all the support my brother garnered. And like I said, for some strange reason, yeah, I lost my brother, but I didn't process losing him yet. All I knew was my community was hurting at that time. So I remember speaking to everybody as a whole, as this is what we need as a community. So now that I've learned so much in the years, talking about police shootings, that is a big deal. You know, like I also work at Legal Aid Society. I'm a paralegal as well. And we have what we call a CAPSTAT project, where we track bad officers. It's public domain, you guys can look it up. And you will be surprised how much the city pays every single year in small claim settlements for officers with misconduct. Imagine if they were paying those settlements out of their own pension, out of their own funds. Then maybe they'll think twice about doing something negative. Maybe they'll think twice. Then we got Pat Lynch. Every time something happens, he's screaming. And I am that guy. I'll tell you, I know there's a lot of great cops out there. I know that. But we have to hold you accountable as well. There's way too many videos. It's George Floyd, where you're just standing there letting it happen. So yeah, I am curious as to initiatives to attack police directly. Obviously, everywhere is calling for defund and divest and invest. That is directly to the point. And then even to that point, when I talk about families on the front lines, we all know in this call, I'm almost positive if we're all been paying attention to that conversation, we hear conflicting arguments as to how. Is it abolishment? Is it defund? What does divest and invest mean? We're having that own fight within ourselves. But then when we ask the families, how do we feel about it? We know what we mean by divest and invest. We know where the money needs to go to figure out how to combat the police so we can get the information we need to fight our individual cases. I found out the officer who murdered my brother had 2 prior police settlements for brutality. Had we known that earlier during the trial time, maybe that would have showed jurors that this is not a coincidence. He's done this in the past. The officer who murdered George Floyd, it came out later. He had 17 misconduct incidents on his rap sheet.
Well, that's why I direct the question to the police unions, because they're too protective of bad officers to the detriment of the police forces themselves and the community. And it seems like that's the point of, that needs to really change. The fact that a bad officer can go from one department to the other and they don't, when I was studying the Somerville police, the officers told me, well, you're going to find a lot of different people on the force during your time here, because it turns out that the department just didn't want to spend money on background checks for an 8-year period. And so we've got these younger officers who are held to this standard, but then we've got a lot of other people out there, they weren't vetted at all, and now they're just in, they're in and they can't be out. And that's going on, I have to tell you, that's going on like 33 years ago. So nothing's changed in that respect.
Definitely appreciate the question. Go ahead, Nissa.
Okay, yeah. Michael, I answered your police union question in the chat, but I do want to talk a little bit about that, and then also about coming to the table with police officers. There's a lot of smoke and mirrors when it comes to police community relations. They have largely, a lot of the police reforms that have happened over the last several decades have been cosmetic. It's really about, we want to continue to pump the false narrative that police are there to protect and serve us. They're now they have YouTube channels and social media accounts continuously pumping out all the great things that they're doing, which is, again, largely cosmetic. And that's the smoke and mirrors I'm talking about. And usually when they are brought to the table to sit with people like myself to talk about police reform, etc., they're sending their public relations person. And frankly, the panels that I've sat on here locally in Las Vegas, they've straight up lied about their involvement with impacted people. There was a panel here. I wasn't on this panel, but I was in the audience. They said that they had a van that went around to communicate and be a liaison for impacted people when their loved one is killed, that they send a trauma van, and that those are mental health workers that sit down with the family and explain everything that's happening and then assess their needs. That's a total lie. It's a complete lie. None of that is true. There is a van, a program here that does do that in terms of like servicing people who are victims of violent crime, but that doesn't include our impacted people. That doesn't include when violence happens from the state. And so, we've been here locally, we've been asked to have impacted people sit on panels with police officers. And frankly, that's like asking a rapist to sit down with their rape victim. You know what I'm saying? So it's kind of
is
like—
Ruffle coming? No, it's Ruffle kindling.
Sorry. Oh my God.
Tiffany, are you able to mute everyone?
Yeah, I muted everyone except for Nissa. Nissa,
Sorry,
can you?
Victor.
Yeah, okay, no problem. So it's hard to make that whole like fairness situation happen, because frankly the police have never really been that honest about addressing police violence, and right now we're in a space where we're talking about, okay, do we divest, do we defund, do we abolish, do we reform? And I want folks to understand that we've been in conversation in this movement about police reform for the last several decades. And just like Michael said, nothing has really improved. I mean, people get killed regularly on a regular basis still. There's still no justice for these families. The conviction rate in regards to police homicides is literally less than 0.5%, meaning that 99.5% of these cases, the killer walks free. And so we have an incredibly unbalanced system where police have all the power, and they have the power to literally break into our homes and kill us and not be held accountable for that. And in fact, in regards to even within the police department, you know, there's a group in New York, 100 Black Cops, they talk about the racism that they experience inside their department. But that's still not like, you know, a lot of people say like, oh, well, you know, we just need to diversify the department. Delron Small was killed by a Black cop. Nicholas Hayward Jr., 13 years old, was killed by a Black cop. It's not about the race of the police officer. It's about whether or not you're part of upholding a white supremacist society or not. And if you're going to be a police officer, you can't be that one person that's going to make individual change, because the institution of policing is rooted in white supremacy. And it's not until people realize that we're going to be really informed and understand how we need to move forward. And, you know, that's why I'm particularly against the idea of police reform. Not that I don't think that reforms should happen, but I think that when we talk about police reform, it really means a complete restructuring of the police department and a complete dismantling of a white supremacist system. And also, the last thing I want to say is that what people don't understand also, which we didn't even talk about, which is a very serious issue, is the police intimidation that eyewitnesses receive and also impacted families for speaking out. Nicholas Hayward spoke out again for close to 25 years for his son's killing, to just have the case relooked at, reinvestigated. And he was arrested in that first couple of years. He was arrested 7 times for no reason. He was walking his dog on a leash. He got arrested for not having his dog on a leash, even though his dog was on a leash. His second son, who, you know, his brother was killed when he was only 6 years old, had to leave the state because he was starting to get targeted by police in his neighborhood, and police knew who he was. And so he left. He took his whole family and he moved out of the state. He's living in Atlanta, Georgia right now. So what people don't realize is that when families speak up, they're really literally risking their lives to do this work, to speak for their loved ones. The police intimidation is real. It's constant. It perpetuates PTSD. I have PTSD also. We just recently had a journalist almost get killed by the police because he was targeted for the work that he does with us and the work that he does in the community. It's just horrendous, and nobody talks about it because it's scary. And that's it.
Okay, thank you. Kara had the next question. Kara Westerkamp.
Hi, thank you both. This has been really interesting. And hello from DC, our nation's capital. I guess I've been following this, and I'm also an attorney, and you know, I've obviously never had experiences like both of you have talked about, by virtue probably of the color of my skin. But you know, a couple of things I kind of wanted to get more information from both of you about is kind of what your thoughts are on the militarization of the police, because, you know, it seems like all these local police departments, and I just saw this the other day on Facebook, you know, they're like, hey, look at this new truck we got, and it's a huge Humvee because, you know, the US military has all this excess stuff that they just give to local police departments. And so I feel like over time, you know, every little small town in America probably has their own SWAT unit. And so it just kind of seems like, instead of, you know, the neighborhood policing that maybe we were more familiar with growing up, or what we would like to think should be the standard, is that basically, you know, it's like police units have just become so militarized. And again, like, you know, the no-knock warrant things, and just all of these legal issues that I think a lot of lawyers here could talk about ad nauseum. But so one, I wanted to get your thoughts on kind of just the militarization of the police, where I think, you know, you guys were talking about how it's scary, right? You come up and it's a wall of police and it's a wall of shields, and it's just, that just didn't really seem to be an appropriate or balanced response to, you know, people peacefully protesting. And I also kind of wanted to get, and as I understand, you know, you seem like maybe the best solution is just the complete dismantling of the police and kind of rebuilding, but kind of what your thoughts are both on more like national standards, whether it's abolishing the chokehold or, really just creating more uniform training, and even whether, and I think I put this in my question like to the group, but even looking at maybe some people just really aren't suited to be cops because they're inherently bullies and they inherently want to bully people and inherently, you know, probably will cross the line because that gives them power. And so maybe even thoughts on like whether it's more counseling, group counseling, individual therapy, or maybe emotional intelligence tests for police officers where, you know, maybe the guy that just, you know, like for instance, I think Officer Chauvin in Minneapolis had an indecent number of
Yeah, so
prior.
like,
Sorry, no, sorry, I didn't know what happened there.
I had
Just,
to
but
mute
just
everybody
kind
again.
of just kind of your thoughts on those issues where again, it just seems, I don't know where we go from here. And I don't know if it's possible to completely dismantle and rebuild, but if there are ways that you both think would be effective in order to get us to a better place.
So yeah, that's also a great question. And to tackle the militarization, right? Let's paint a few pictures. So I don't know if you guys have been seeing, so in Camden, New Jersey, right? There was a viral video going around of a man wielding a knife in the middle of the street. And then the video depicted the officers not really engaging, but kind of forming a barrier between this young man and the civilians. But they walked with him for 5 blocks, talking to him, de-escalating him. Only time they turned the sirens on was just to cross the intersection. So they gave the young man space to move around. Minneapolis, they're redoing their whole department from top to bottom. There are some states and there are some cities who got the message. There are some who said, you know, we can't continue to do it this way. And Camden, New Jersey is one of those exemplary departments that said, okay, we have to do it different. They built from the ground up community style. Like they incorporated pieces of community in their rebuild. And to paint the other picture of the militarization, it's traumatizing. It truly is. It's traumatizing. So aside from the police brutality work, I also do work at Legal Aid around NYPD's, New York City's gang database or criminal group database, so to speak. For those of you who live in New York, there's been countless raids throughout the city in the last few years, like large-scale raids. One of the biggest ones up here was the Bronx 120 in Eastchester Gardens, where 120 folks were locked up and swept in a raid, militarized style, 5 in the morning, flashbang grenades, helicopters, the whole 9 yards, FBI, Joint Task Force, the whole shebang. Out of the 120 folks who got traumatized in that raid, don't you know only 17 were actually indicted? 17 folks were involved. And that's because the police tactics, they just label folks on this database without anybody knowing. So when I think of militarized units, even going to a protest where it's tense and folks are just trying to speak, nobody really wants to do that. But then you have this line, and we're already fighting oppression. We're trying to fight people just trying to keep us, you know, caged in. And then you come out and do this. So it's like you're trying to show this power. It's like a push and pull or some form of mental tug of war or something like that. Where in other spaces, if you just let folks talk, like I've even seen, you know, throughout the weeks of watching the protests, I'm looking at different cities and seeing how the law enforcement, the local law enforcement divisions are handling the protesters. There were some cities where they weren't even, engagement was their last resort. They just didn't want to do it. But then you compare it to New York, and we've got officers ramming cars through crowds. So the militarization, in my opinion, it truly is a scare tactic, but the problem with it is, it's more than a scare tactic to folks who've dealt with trauma. To folks who've dealt with trauma, it's opening an old wound, you know what I mean? When you see that, because you think of that oppressive nature, that oppressive state that you were once in. So it does nothing but escalate emotions. It does nothing but perpetuate what we're dealing with right then in the moment. So I never understood it, and quite frankly, it just bothers the hell out of me. And like I said, you know, I am a humanitarian. I look at everyone as a human, but to try to find good in something that's so bad and you know it's bad, but you can't do anything about it, is what's kind of disheartening at times.
Kara, thanks for your message or your question. Yeah, definitely demilitarization of police has to happen. And, you know, we've been, you know, a lot of people have been utilizing the term defund the police, but because people are so scared of the idea of abolition, sometimes starting with that term isn't helpful. And so I think starting with demilitarization makes a lot of sense, just because it makes, I mean, immediately it makes sense. It's like, why would police need a tank? And I was just on a call earlier today with a bunch of teachers who are now starting to look at the local school district here and how many instances there have been of police violence on the school grounds, you know, kids getting pepper sprayed and kids getting tased. And, you know, what was revealed was that the school police here actually have a tank. And it's like, why would school police need a tank, right? And so I think demilitarization is very important. It's a great entry point into talking about the role of policing in our society. Like, why would we ever need tanks? Why are we going to war with our civilians? And then that also ties the larger issue of militarization in general, and how the US government is a crazy war machine that's out of control, and occupying, you know, close to 200 nations around the country. And how they skill share. I mean, you have like Commissioner Ray Kelly being shipped to Haiti and to Palestine and Israel to teach their police how to police their own people and brutalize their own people. I mean, it's just frankly a terrible, it's an alarming situation that's been happening for decades. I think that, you know, I think right now it's really important to engage people in the topic of what we can do in regards to moving towards, and I mean, I think abolition frankly scares a lot of people, but one thing that we can talk about with people in our community to kind of get to the idea of abolition and dismantling the police departments is to really question the role of policing. What do we need them for? Are they really fighting crime? How effective are they in fighting crime? In regards to, you know, statistics and research that's been shown, police are largely ineffective in fighting crime. You know, half of violent crimes are not reported. The ones that are reported, only less than half are actually solved or closed, whatever that means. Property crimes, only a third of property crimes are reported, and it's like maybe 20% or less than 20% that get solved or closed, again, whatever that means. So what do we need police for? What is the point? I mean, it seems more like we need social workers. We need mental health care professionals to help de-escalate tense situations. We need to be engaged in talking about peaceful solutions and creating solutions where nobody's getting hurt. So thank you for your question. I do think that, you know, abolition might be the goal, or dismantling the white supremacist system that we have might be the goal. We don't necessarily know the steps to get there, but as long as we have an eye on that, you know, that goal, I think things will start to organically move in that direction.
And as a follow-up, and I'd mentioned this in my rambling question, and I apologize. I was up until 4:30 this morning writing a brief, so I told Tiffany, like, I'm pretty much almost going to drop pretty soon. But just in the context too of, like, for the current police officers, are there things that you both think could be done to attempt to weed out the bad apples? Because I think that it's what's the saying, right? Like, one bad apple can spoil, you know, your whole bag of fruit you bought from the grocery store, right? Because just with the pheromones it gives off. So I mean, are there things that you both think can be done now to start the process of, like, let's get rid of the people that should not be police officers?
So recently Cuomo just passed a bill that families have been working for a while, and repealing 58. So for those who don't know, 58 was a bill that actually protected police personnel records as to their misconduct records, and any pretty much stint on their jacket, literally. So those records are powerful enough. So now that they're public and the bill's been signed, like, we can FOIA request that information now. But we're saying there needs to be some sort of a database or something created where we can actually go back and look at these records and look at these officers, just like Derek Chauvin in Minneapolis. We need to go and review a person with a history and a rap sheet That's that long. You're literally out here committing crimes and getting away with it because you carry a badge and a gun. So yeah, for right now training, yes, but the issue with training is who's doing the training. You know, how can you be inclusive to say, okay, somebody's doing a cultural kind of training or a racial justice training for officers so they can understand how to interact with young black men in the black community? You know, who's doing the trainings? It doesn't add up to me in that manner. But for now, yeah, like the first thing we need to do is utilize the Repeal 58 bill and look at officers' records. It's 38,000 officers in New York City. I'm sure, I don't know if 38,000 have a record. Maybe some, maybe not be as egregious as others, but that's a start. Because for right now, like in my brother's case, yeah, unfortunately we got an acquittal on the trial, but we're also in departmental hearings now. We're trying to get him fired because based on his previous case and this case, there's no reason an officer who's just willing to shoot a civilian should still be patrolling us. There's no reason. So at the very least, he should be at fire, at the very least, to protect other community members.
And even like to go off that, again, this is just fascinating to hear, like a lot of professions like medical doctors, they've got medical boards, right? If somebody's like, you literally killed somebody because you left the scissors in the stomach,
Yep.
You know, you can be disbarred as a doctor. You can be disbarred as a lawyer. So it's almost maybe there needs to be more thought of like, why aren't people that literally hold the power of life and death over others also subject to some kind of oversight like that, I guess.
So can I add a little bit more to that? Because even earlier you were talking about what do we see as far as like legislative change, things like that. So with this campaign, right, when we say families are the front line, that means so much more than saying, oh, we want to be in the front line so you can hear our story. It's much bigger than that. On the legislative front, even like so locally for New York, Cuomo signed all those bills about 2 weeks ago that, like I said, families work religiously to work in that damn language. We needed these bills passed because some of it will help fight our individual cases. But ultimately, the ultimate goal is to get bills passed on the federal level. We have to have bills in place, kind of like banning the chokehold, right? But on the locally, that's fine and great. But federally, it governs the entire nation. In almost every single case, at least 97%, there's only 3% of cases where some folks have interpreted the officer's actions as an accident. 3% of cases. The rest, they were dead wrong. The rest, they've all said, I was in fear of my life, and that's it. They just say that, and everything's justified. Oh, he was scared. Somebody could have acted. And then the bill that we have now, which is previously an executive order for the special prosecutor bill, and there it says the special prosecutor can only take on police-involved shootings of unarmed civilians. That's it. But we've seen cases, Saeed Vasu in Crown Heights, 2018, same thing. This man had a pipe in his hand, just a pipe, like a metal pipe. That was it. And they murdered him and said it looked like a gun. But nobody said they were in fear of their life, though. So on a federal level, we can able to work with that language to change it where officers can't say that. Now, there are some bills where it shows a progressive state, like what warrants excessive force? What's too much? You know what I mean? And right now, we don't have those systems in place, so officers aren't being accountable. Everything is just, that's what they had to do, and that's not right.
Okay, I think we have time for one more question. And Mendy White, you had a...
Can I
Hi.
just respond also
Hi,
really
everyone.
quickly?
Oh.
Is that possible?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, I just wanted to address what Victor was talking about in regards to, you know, how officers get off. So police brutality is actually legal in the States, which is why we don't have a large conviction rate. The two Supreme Court cases is Tennessee versus Garner and Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. And those two Supreme Court cases, there needs to be a national movement to overturn these Supreme Court cases, because these cases, basically what was found in these cases was that as long as an officer believes that he is in pursuit of someone who is going to harm somebody else, that's why we have so many cases where people are shot in the back. It's like, oh, well, they were going to go hurt somebody else, so therefore it justifies me utilizing lethal force. And then the other is if they believe that their life was threatened. And, you know, the police, they talk about this stuff all the time. They have like workshops around it, how to get off free, you know, get off without any consequences. And so those in particular, those two cases need to be overturned. And then also in regards to the police secrecy around, the reason why a lot of states are calling for independent investigations, like Wisconsin passed a bill a few years ago. Michael Bell, the father of killed in the police interaction. He actually worked with Serpico on this bill and spent his entire civil settlement to pass this bill in the state, which made it which basically any police related killing has to be independently investigated. The problem is that even though this law has been passed, it hasn't been very effective. And the reason why is because, well, who's going to investigate, right? Like, that's the problem. It's like, who is the independent governing body that's going to go in and investigate these killings? Because, you know, the corruption is on every level of government. It's not just local police departments, it's also the FBI, it's also the Department of Justice. So, you know, that becomes another barrier to these issues. And in regards to police unions in particular, there's a piece of legislation that also needs to be repealed, which is the Peace Officer Bill of Rights, which is not federal, it's state by state, but is being adopted by states all across the country and has been implemented. And that in particular is the bill that allows for the legislation that allows for police misconduct records to be sealed, which is why when you look at these cases, there are some police that have killed 3 or 4 people in the last, 5 years or whatever, and they just continue to kill people because they're not being held accountable, and there's, their records are sealed, so nobody knows about it. So that is a piece of legislation that, again, really needs to be dismantled. So I just wanted to answer that.
Okay, thank you. Mendy, we can take our last question.
Hi, everyone. I'm actually a family and criminal law attorney in New York, and a lot of the things that have happened recently were such as the discovery laws in New York State, which dramatically changed everything in New York about making sure that all the paperwork was given over, and not like all these other states where you're hearing 15 years later, oh, they hid this text message or they hid these emails. And also the fact that they had a case in the Second Circuit in federal court recently, like this week or last, I believe, where they got qualified immunity was actually dismantled in that case. The question is, what is being done? I guess, for one, qualified immunity is one of the biggest issues, and obviously we all know that was created by the Supreme Court itself. But have you seen for example, in the discovery cases, how that's helped people in regards to their criminal cases? And these, as we all know, I think one of my cop friends called it a dropsy, which, for example, they'll drop a gun that they found at one drug deal, and they'll drop it when they shoot somebody in another drug deal in order to protect themselves. And these things like that, have you found that these like discovery laws and all these other things that have been passed in New York, at least, that they're having any effect to protect people that you've noticed in order to get to, I guess, more justice if someone's falsely arrested and so on?
So I'm trying to follow. You mean falsely arrested in a police brutality case, or just generalized?
In a police brutality case, like you said, the guy who was caught with walking his dog, but actually had a leash on, like body cams. Now that they're having, New York has to wear body cams, for example, meaning all these different things. That is it less likely that someone's going to be arrested falsely for these crimes, or is it just is it can continue no matter what laws are passed for the foreseeable future?
I mean, so right now, it just sucks really, because officers here, we don't really get, like, the discovery laws are different in a police case because you're kind of working with families are working with the prosecutors, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And then what happens in a lot of these cases is when the shooting first happens, it literally takes a few hours to find out who's going to investigate the case. So as soon as the shooting happens, you get force response unit that comes from the NYPD, and then the internal affairs and all these other officers that converge on the scene, and they start collecting evidence, right? But still, we don't know if the attorney general and special prosecutor is going to take the case, because they have to substantiate if the civilian was unarmed and not first, right? And then they have to figure it out. So what happens is, if the AG office does take a case, they're actually still relying on NYPD to collect all of the evidence. So we don't know if they're collecting every single thing. We don't know if they're knocking down every single door. We don't know if they're handling or mishandling anything they are collecting. So even with the discovery laws now in place, yes, even working out legally now, it's helped us for our clients that we defend, yes. But in this world, it's completely different. Like, we actually trying to fight for the AG's office to get a specialized private investigative unit. We've even been trying to figure out on the family side, on the nonprofit side, can we even raise enough funds to hire investigators or to have money around for independent autopsies? So it's so much that families rely on that's still in the city or government's hands in that beginning stages. That's the most important thing possible. Independent autopsy is one of the most important things for any family member who suffers from the hands of police brutality. But imagine how much they cost. So when it comes to discovery, it really varies on how fast NYPD moves, but how fast we can substantiate if the special prosecutor is going to investigate the case or not.
And my understanding is that when the cops are after a shooting, they're given a certain amount of time. I believe it's like 24 hours to get an attorney, get their story straight before they're actually questioned by somebody else. Whereas you or me, if we commit a crime, we're arrested instantly. We have no time. If I don't know, again, we can tell, if you haven't noticed, I'm a white Jewish boy from Brooklyn. I've never had an issue with a cop except when someone mugged me and I took me to look for him. But otherwise, thank God, never had an issue except someone said Hail Hitler once, I think. That's about it. But my client, if a girl says her boyfriend hit her, he's arrested that night. But a cop, he has 24 hours before they do anything. Except that I wrote in the chat about that Asian cop, but I cannot remember his name, who, as I spoke to my friend who's a sergeant in NYPD, the union is threw into the wolves. Why, I still don't understand. But they have people who kill all these people. Amadou Diallo was molested and sodomized by a cop, and the union helped him. But an Asian officer who shot somebody in a dark, in a NYCHA house. He got nothing. But like I said, it's horrendous to watch. And I don't believe in these media. I don't believe in the extreme that that Nissa said. I'll agree to disagree on certain things, but I do believe that cops should be treated like everyone else. They're human, just like you and me, and that there's no reason that they should have more latitude than you and I, especially because they're trusted with guns, and they should have more emotional training. I think I read 10 hours of training on how to work with people with mental disabilities, but 120 hours at the range. So maybe take more time to tell how to deal with people in the different communities. If you're a white Anglo-Saxon Irishman, you don't know how to deal with someone in Brownsville because you might have grown up in a middle-class neighborhood, but Brownsville is a poor black neighborhood. Or go to Canarsie, which is a black middle-class neighborhood in Brooklyn. Each neighborhood has to be treated, you have to deal with people differently than you would in a Long Island rich white suburb. So, but thank you guys for your talk. It's very interesting.
Okay, thank you. Victor and Nissa, did you want to respond to that, or do you want to continue to our sections?
I think the only thing that I want to say is that, that just what Victor was saying, like, the police have complete control over the crimes investigation, and that's largely the problem. I mean, here we just had a impacted families meeting here locally on Sunday, and literally every single family member said that when their loved one was killed, the police officers involved moved the bodies of their loved one. I mean, it's just horrendous. the amount of sabotage. And I mean, really, I've literally seen NYPD just cover up stuff right after a killing. We were on ground after the killing of Chantel Davis in Brooklyn, New York. I think that might have been 2012. We were just coming back from a Ramarley Graham vigil. Ramarley Graham was a young man who was killed in his own house in the Bronx. And it was announced that another person had been killed and was like right by our house. And we went down there. Nicholas Hayward was with us. And we saw groups of NYPD officers just go from building to building to business to confiscate the surveillance cameras to make sure that no one would have the video of the killing. And to this day, I don't think any video has been released in regards to Chantel Davis's case, but I'm pretty sure that it was on camera. So, go ahead.
Let me add one piece of that too. The reason why it's so important too, especially with these legislative changes, and I've been saying this since Cuomo signed the bills, this doesn't change anything. It just gives us some little additional tools to fight for our cases. So one thing that this does help is, and you seeing this in every single case, almost immediately, the victim becomes a suspect. The victim becomes, dehumanized. They were the worst of the worst. So they had this, or they sold cigarettes, or they did that, or they did this. Mm-hmm. That's instantaneously. Yeah. So when we have NYPD, the first ones on the scene, wrapping up all of this evidence and getting everything, like you said, Tiffany, they're the ones getting their story straight. They have time to get their story straight. Now we have families waiting hours and hours and hours to figure out if our loved one's going to be moved to the hospital, to figure out who to talk to. So the 6, 7, 8 hours we're standing on a crime scene waiting to get information, they're back at 1 PP Plaza getting their story together and about to do a press release. Yep. So we're already 10 steps behind them because we know absolutely nothing. So by the time the narrative comes out, we have to combat the narrative and can't even pay attention much to the case. Because the only way we can garner support is that first impression. The first thing the community sees on the news, or maybe the first few things. But unfortunately, that's the family's job. It's our job. It's Force Trajectory's job to help us get those stories out almost immediately.
Thank you. Thank you. Okay. Now we wanted to turn to the local issues section, and Katherine Graves, was going to share her story, just being a regular citizen, walking around Midtown East when she was assaulted by a homeless drunk woman while she was wearing a BLM shirt. So I just wanted to give some time for Katherine to share with us her story, because that's another one that's very uncovered. And, I had some talks with the captain on her case recently too, and just email exchanges, and it's been very tough dealing with them for them to take it seriously. So I'm going to turn it over to Katherine.
Thank you, Tiffany. And thank you, Victor and Nissa, both for being willing to relive your trauma here in this space so that we can better understand these issues, and for the information that you've given to this group. It's really appreciated. And I don't want to take the spotlight off of this conversation about police brutality. Obviously, my instance was not that, but I don't want to take up space in that conversation. So I was trying to think of where my story maybe sat within that larger context. And I wanted to go back to something that Nissa said, which is essentially, what are the police for, right? So I think one of the arguments in this conversation about defunding or abolishing the police is police at their worst is police brutality. It's police killings, it's police violence. And then the response to that is, those are a few bad apples. That's a whole other argument, and I could talk about that for a while. But so the other side of that is, okay, then what about the police on their best behavior? What about police when they're actually doing their job? And that was more of my experience of police inaction or police incompetence that I think also serves that conversation of, okay, what are police for, and why does defundment or why does abolishment still need to happen even when police are on their best behavior? So I was walking in Midtown on the 20th of this month. I was walking from Grand Central to my partner's apartment on the Upper East Side, and I had my music in and was walking down the street, and I was verbally assaulted by this white woman who appeared to be very drunk. I didn't realize at the time, but then later found out that she was homeless or housing insecure. I won't recapitulate the language that she used against me, but it's suffice it to say, was entirely racially charged and involved metaphorizing or sort of comparing me to animals. And she got in my face at one point and also commented on my hair, which is just normally hands on sight, but I won't go into that either. You know, I had this interaction with this woman, and because I'm a millennial, I immediately put it online and was essentially like, can the internet help me find this woman? And can we achieve, you know, internet justice in this situation? And you know, there was this outpouring of information over the next several days, kind of this, you know, media churning of the story in different spaces, and more information about the woman came out. And one of the things that resulted in Tiffany and I getting connected was the fact that you know, Tiffany had also had an experience with this woman, and as did many other people of color who reached out to me via different media outlets saying that they had been verbally attacked by her using racial epithets, and there were just too many stories to name, and also too many stories to not make this a racist incident and not make this about race. This was not just someone with a chronic condition that resulted in sort of aggressive behavior. This was also something that had a racist component. And the sort of unsatisfying terminus of this was when I did then go to the police and file a report and essentially, you know, have this conversation with two officers about what could be done in this case, because obviously this woman has a history of specifically choosing targets of color, verbally attacking them, getting in their face, and there's a concern there, A, that this is traumatizing in and of itself, but also that this could escalate and be dangerous specifically to people of color. And where the conversation essentially went is that the two officers that I spoke to knew this woman, which was kind of surprising in and of itself to just sort of enter that in the conversation. They knew this woman, they were familiar with her, had interactions with her before, and were going to go seek her out and speak to her and request of her that she seek out services in the context of you know, getting a caseworker, getting some sort of mental health support, getting some sort of institutionalized help. And obviously that was very unsatisfying. They mentioned several sort of organizations and connections that they were involved with as far as these sort of cases. So co-response was one that they mentioned. And I asked if I was allowed to interface with them directly so that I could be involved in this process. They said no. But the entire conversation just sort of told me that in this context of a very racialized instance, the police officer's role was entirely to serve as middlemen between other organizations who needed to be at the forefront of this situation. And so that's kind of where things have ended. And what it's just sort of made me think about is A, why this does not count in any way as a hate crime, why there is no sort of recourse for verbal harassment, but B, what are the actual necessary resources and what was the value of a police interaction in this case? I would say there was no value whatsoever. As far as I'm a psychology PhD at Yale, and so one thing that I know of people with mental illness, mental disorder, is that it's very unlikely that if it's a chronic sort of situation like this one might have, that she is going to, of her own volition, leave the comfort of her safe space, wherever that might be in New York, and go seek out services that might disrupt whatever sense of normalcy she has generated in her current situation. And so the idea that the sort of terminus of my situation is they're going to ask her to seek services is just not acceptable. And so I think it maybe the one thing that my situation can serve in this context is, again, opening up the question of it's a big enough issue as police on their worst behavior results in severe harm, especially to specific demographics disproportionately in this country. But even when they're on their best behavior, there's a question of what is their value and who could better stand in that place and provide a service. So I just wanted to offer that, and thank you, Tiffany, for letting me come and speak in this space.
Thank you. Thank you. Just for 2 minutes, because I also had the same experience with the same woman, is that what was interesting to me is, and a topic that me and Victor and Nissa were working on is the interrelationship between the Asian and the Black communities with issues. And I thought what was very interesting is that Katherine and I were the two that experienced the same experience with women, and the police gave us shifting excuses. So, and expecting that the two communities probably don't interact with each other. And I do think they profile their victims and kind of like give excuses that sound good to that particular victim. Like with me, they told me that because she used the same, the same N-word, and then she said, go back to your country. And it was the weekend right after President Trump had called it the Chinese virus, that that the cops' explanation to me was that because I'm not a Black woman, then and my husband's not a Black man, then it doesn't fall under the hate crime. But then I called back and I said, by putting it on media, I found another witness who told me that the same woman had tried to push over, the 70-year-old Black woman in Union Square. And then they said, well, but you don't have that witness, you just have an eyewitness to that witness. And then they told me that there was another person that came forward that said that she said the same thing to a class of a majority Black students. She was a teacher, and again, they said, well, you don't have the students, you have the teacher who's white. So so that sounded, and then they added like, well, a white woman resident that lives in your building thinks that she's great. I don't know why they had time to listen to the body cam of that cop, but they never took my testimony. They said that like, well, you were interviewed, but no one ever called me. So I was really excited when I saw Katherine's story, not excited that it happened to her, but I was like, okay, now we have a Black witness. So I called the cop back and I showed him the hate crime statute that said you don't need a touching. And by the way, the video I submitted for my building, they had her hand come out and come near my child. So I said, but menacing, harassment, all of this qualifies. And the mental hygiene law says that, if she's not able to care for herself, then it qualifies. But in response, like, he recognized the problem because he sent me the article about Rashid Brimage, who like had been in and out of the system many, many times, and then, attacked an elderly woman. So they seem to know the problem. And I like what happened between Katherine and I, because now, whatever happens, we might file a New York City Commission of Human Rights complaint, whether something can be done. I do think an alliance is starting across the minority communities to share our stories and to work together. So I think that's the one positive. I do agree the system is not working for us, but we met each other and we're, and we're doing that, so.
I would say that I think one of the things I'm hearing from both Katherine's story, Victor, and Nissa, thank you for sharing your stories. It seems like there seems to be kind of an overarching theme that there's a segment of the police population that do not value minority lives, period. And they seem to believe that regardless of what type of encounter we may have with the community, with the overall population, that they tend to be a bit dismissive of our experiences, our stories, because of their lack of how much they do not value minority lives. Whether it is, my husband is a Black male, like he literally, I remember when we moved into our building, standing outside, he smokes, he's standing outside smoking, and a police car, this was like, we've lived in our building for 7 years, a police car pulled up. And he just hovered there, watching my husband, like, what are you doing? Like, what are you doing? And my husband's a tall guy. And our doorman had to come out and say, is there a problem? And then the cop car took off. This is one of many incidents that we've encountered living here in New York City. And I'm gonna be honest with you, Nissa and Victor, I appreciate your stories. And the rest of us are certainly nowhere near as impacted as you've been, Victor, but I can't help but despair and look at all of the responses we received from some of these corporations, some of these institutions, with cynicism and with skepticism, because we've been here before. I'm going to be honest, we've been here before. And I tell Tiffany all the time, you know what? I know that people want to do better, they want to change, but I'm going to be honest, I just look at all of this with a lot of virtue signaling. I do my best to donate and volunteer, but I do see some of my counterparts do not value my life, my husband's life, my unborn kids. I have 2 kids, my unborn son, like, they do not value that life as the same way they would value somebody else who's literally just another color. And unfortunately, some of those very people end up in positions of power and some of us have no choice but to kind of relent to those individuals. So I do see kind of an overarching theme between the stories that you guys have shared, in that I think there is a segment, a small population or a segment of the police that do not value minority lives. And I'm going to be honest, it's just hard not to despair. So I applaud you guys for continuing to even attempt to change the systemic issues that have been ongoing for centuries, because those of us that have just been watching, I'm from another country, and I've been in this country for almost 30 years, and just the past 30 years, it's just one thing after another, you know, and it's hard not to despair and say, oh God, like, you know what, let me go back to my own country. Let me go back to my own country, whereby, you know, I'm not judged by the color of my skin. It's just, there are enough of us around that my skin is not an issue. You know, people will judge me by my character and my personality. So I applaud you all for even attempting to make, even if just a small change. I applaud you all for joining us and helping us at least shed some light on this ongoing issue. And hopefully we can do our best to support you in any way we can, to help, whether it's financially or to even just to help with the legislature, to help them move the needle, because I don't think any of this is going to change until the majority population takes notice and says, hey, this is an issue. Actually, I had a question for you, Victor and Nissa. Do you see this, I'm not sure if there's a shift. Do you see all of the responses from George Floyd's murder? Do you see this as a shift, or do you think this is more of the same in terms of how some of these institutions are responding to George Floyd's murder?
So first I want to say to Tiffany and Katherine, thank you both for sharing those stories. And this is going right to my direct point, what I'm going to say now. And Mina, also, thank you for pointing that out, because that is a harsh reality a lot of times. Believe me, there's multiple times. Today, for instance, like I said earlier, I was emotional wreck, up and down, up and down. Me and Nissa were talking earlier, trying to get work done. And in the middle of work, I literally said, listen, I'm going offline for a while. She goes, what? We got the panel today. We had a meeting earlier. I said, yeah, that's all I'm doing today. I ain't got it in me. And there's so many times where we just want to quit. There's so many times we just want to give up. There's so many times we apply for paperwork or information or something and we don't get it. And it's like, why? It's simple, basic, why? And it's very disheartening. It truly is. It sucks every time I turn the news on, and it's just like, again, we went from George Floyd to Breonna Taylor to Ahmaud Arbery to Rashard Brooks, like back to back to back to back. It sucks. But the thing that keeps me driving, and your choice of words is pleasantly refreshing, Mina, the attempt. Seriously, because it is an attempt. I promise you, it's an attempt. It's an attempt based off all of these families nationally. It's an attempt based off Nissa's 11 years of covering these stories, and us, and mind you, these covering stories, it doesn't only help the families get their stories out. It helps us families game plan. It helps us families look back in the history and say, well, this is what was happening 5 years ago. This is what changed in this instance. So what we're trying to do is, this attempt is because we have no choice but to keep fighting. We have no choice. Because as you see right now, George Floyd happened, boom, everyone's uprise. And I lost folks to the loved ones. I lost person members in this pandemic, in COVID pandemic alone, and it sucks. But I also know this pandemic helped show a lot of things. It helped bring a lot of things to the forefront. Folks didn't have to go to work. Folks didn't have to go to school. We were stuck in the house. We were forced to stare at our damn devices and see what's going on in the world. It exposed what we already knew. And it made everybody uncomfortable. It made white folk uncomfortable. It made them say, wow, this is what everyone was talking about? Duh! So back to that point of the attempt, now I'm starting to see that plateau. Now we're seeing phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. Unemployment rate was crazy. Everybody has to try to find back into the job. Everyone's trying to see what's gonna open up first, where can I apply, who's hiring, who's not. So now that frenzy is gonna happen. It's gonna happen. But how do we keep the attention on the prize? How do we show? It's by this diversity coming, the cultural indifferences. Right now, to me, I don't care about poor community, rich community, black community, Spanish community. Everything that Katherine just talked about, that Tiffany just talked about, Mina, what you just expressed, this is not only about police brutality. It's about every injustice, every one of them. Even the traumatic experiences that Katherine had to deal with just from another civilian. These traumatic experiences lend to everything we're going through now and how we respond to it. So if we can't protect community members, right, like Katherine and somebody else, then yeah, how can she look at abolishment and be comfortable with that? You get what I'm saying? So sometimes it's really understanding each community so we can be unified. We can't be unified under just my mission. We can't. So how do we be inclusive of everything so there is equal change? How do we get those non-progressive electeds or whatever to really look at it and say, well, it's affecting my community too? So yes, Mina, it is an attempt, but this is an attempt where I finally feel like my teachings from the late Nicholas Haywood, my teachings from the great Cynthia Howell, having Nissa and having a strong army of families right now, who a lot of you guys haven't even heard of, to see the fire in their eyes, to say that now is the time, I can't look at this as a attempt anymore. It has to get done because now my kids are watching me. Eventually, I'm gonna have to sit down and say, okay, we did it. Eventually, but I can't get my loved one back. I honestly do this for the kids, and excuse my words, but so nobody else in this call gets the phone that I got before, the call that I got. That's why we keep doing it.
Thanks, Mina, for your question. I do think that this is different. I do feel that just what Victor was saying, it forced everybody to see what was happening. I think this is a real, even the protests are dying down, and, we're probably going to go through a couple more shutdowns due to COVID. I don't think that matters. I think what matters is that everybody that's interested, that's here, stay engaged, do their part. We're doing a lot of heavy lifting, but it doesn't have to be the case. Like, we can share that burden all together as a community. And there's just no way that, our organization should be the only media organization telling family stories. You know what I mean? We are very interested in expanding. We're very interested in training people on how to interview families and get these stories out. I've been an educator for a very, very long time. We're interested in doing webinars and et cetera, with a larger community to get people to know how to work with impacted families and to do the media production that we do. This is something that's for everybody, all of us, because the reality is that any of us could be impacted by this in the future, today, tomorrow, next year, et cetera. And violence, the whole point of this work is so that violence doesn't end up on anybody else's doorstep. And it's going to happen today, and it's going to happen tomorrow. This is a calling for each one of us as human beings to stand up for human rights and dignity in the ways that we should be treated as human beings. I think that I do really think that this is a different kind of experience. We've never received in the response that we've gotten. I haven't seen that. I've never heard of that. In talking in all the years of the different families that we've worked with, some who have been fighting for 25 years, 20 years, they've never seen anything like this either. So we just have to, keep this on the brain, keep this in conversations, have uncomfortable conversations with employees, coworkers, students, other teachers, et cetera, in our community, in our family. We have to continue to push this topic, this uncomfortable, very traumatizing topic, so that we can organize and get our ducks in a row and defeat this killing machine, And so I applaud all of you for staying this long and listening to us, and I implore all of you to stay engaged and stay involved.
Yeah, I'm gonna just second that. Our hopes, Mina and I, is that, it doesn't stop with this conversation tonight, and that we're gonna continue to follow up. And tomorrow I'll send an email definitely to everyone that's participating here and RSVP'd, and to all our groups about ways that we can financially continue to support Forced Trajectory and Victor's Families Are the Frontline campaign. And also, we do hope that Nissa and Victor, that this is not, you know, a one-time, that we get to continue to follow up and learn about how we can continue to contribute to your causes. So we want to stay in touch, and I want everyone that came here tonight to continue to stay active in this effort, so that we're not, you know, it's not just a, you know, one night type of thing. Mina, I don't know if you had any last words, or Victor.
You want to go ahead, Victor?
Yeah, sorry. No, I was trying to type too. No, I really, really, really appreciate the platform. Like me and Nissa been saying, you know, the time for us is now. And, you know, it is refreshing that this happened just out of a passion, right? And a love for other folks. But the real success is, you know, really, really quickly, I remember we went to Vegas, the first trip we took, and there was a family member from St. Louis. Her son was murdered 17 years ago, and she has never spoken about her story, ever, like literally, like never, because she never had the support, she never had the platform, and the grief was too much for her. She just couldn't do it. And she finally came out. And how powerful she was. At the first time ever speaking, it lit a fire in me to say, this is why we're doing this, to give these families their voice, to give these families that empowerment they need, or from the knowledge that we've obtained to be able to do this work. So like Nissa said, please stay involved. Don't plateau, you know? And for any families, folks who wonder, like, one of the worst feelings for a family member is, I went to a few rallies in the city. The last one I went to was at Barclays on Atlantic Avenue. My brother was murdered on Atlantic and Bradford. And I see all of these signs, all of these postings, justice for Breonna Taylor, justice for George Floyd, justice for Kiki, justice for all these folks. And I had to say, well, where's Delron? In your own backyard, you don't know. But I couldn't be slighted by that. I was motivated to say, I need to do more education about my brother's story. But there's so many other families that feel that way. So it's taken a lot out of us to even get them to look at this as a positive light and say, you know what, let's come together though. It's fine. Now we've got community's attention. So the fact that we were able to get your attention just for this evening, for these 2 hours, I'm truly, truly appreciative just to be able to share my brother's story with you all. So thank you for giving me the platform, and thank you for hearing me out tonight.
Thank you so much, Victor. Nissa, did you want to say anything to close out?
Yeah, I put our information, our contact information, our website, our socials, and then also our donate button. And then also I added the Venmo for Families Are the Frontline. The Families Are the Frontline campaign will be developing a donate link pretty soon with their fiscal sponsor. So stay tuned for that. That should probably be, you know, in the next couple of days, I guess, or next week that happens. And I wanted to say that, you know, in terms of takeaways and just, you know, calls to action, you know, if you're in the midst of organizing an event or a panel, or you want, you know, make sure you center those who are directly impacted. Make sure you invite Victor back. Make sure you invite families that you've never heard their stories before back, you know, because the reality is that, you know, these families have faced just incredible trauma, and they're constantly being victimized because people think, oh, they're victims, and so therefore we should cry for them, but they shouldn't be invited to the table when it comes to solutions. And that's just BS, because there, again, everything that I know, I was taught by impacted people. And so we need to really embrace them. We need to embrace their stories. We need to embrace their leadership and their wisdom that they have to share with the rest of the community. And we have to collectively process their trauma so that they can breathe. And that we have to take on some of that vicarious trauma and work that for our bodies as well. So one of the things that you can do is when you see stuff on social media, you know, around a national case, that's great. Share that, you know, but then also share like 3 or 4 stories that you've never heard before. You know, look for those, especially locally. If you have everybody, there's, you know, police brutality exists literally in every zip code. So there is somebody that's hurting in your community. do some research and find who those people are, get connected with them, see how you can support them. So yeah, so sharing unheard stories. And then in regards to like solutions, there's been a lot of folks that have been just jumping on the bandwagon of police reform. That's really damaging if you don't know what you're talking about. Police reform, like I said, is cop speak. It's been utilized as a way to appease the public. So it's like, oh yeah, we know there's an issue. So here, we're gonna pass this legislation, everything's gonna be okay. And that's just frankly how that field of police reform has been operating decades. So really important to center impacted people, follow their leadership, share untold stories, and continue to advocate for those who haven't yet had the chance to share their story. Thank you.
Nissa. And thank you everyone for joining us. If you can, I know obviously things are a little weird right now with COVID, but if you can, let's help lift up some of these families and help support them financially as much as possible, because I think just a little bit of financial support will help get some of their stories out. I'm going to be honest, I was not familiar with Victor's story prior to being introduced to Nissa and Victor by Tiffany. I think being able to get them out there and share their stories, and hopefully we'll be able to reach out to some of the legislature to help change some of the problems and the laws that are currently empowering some of these people, will go a long way. So if you can, please do what you can to support. Nissa provided all the links there. We will share tomorrow the links via email, as well as also in the various groups that we belong to. So if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to myself or Tiffany. And we thank you for being so patient and joining us tonight. I know it's been a long night, but I appreciate it. Tiffany appreciates it. We all appreciate it. And if you want to reach out to Nissa and Victor, please, they provided all their contact information there, or you can reach out to Tiffany or myself and we will provide their information. All right. Thank you, everyone. Hopefully you guys have a wonderful, fantastic night. Thank you, Victor. Thank you, Katherine. Thank you, Nissa, for all of you for sharing your wonderful stories. And hopefully we will do a little bit of something, even if it's just a little bit, to move the needle forward.
Thank you so much.
Night.
Night, guys.
Thank you. Good night.
Night,
Thank you, everyone.
night.
Take care.